This is the Doc and Krueger cast, the official podcast of Doc and Krueger Games. Season 1, Episode 10. Roleplay for Roleplay. Hello friends, and welcome to yet another episode of the Doc and Krueger cast. I'm Chris Krueger, and I'm joined today by Adam Doc Brackin.
Hey everybody.
And today we're continuing our series on design and RPG, tabletop philosophy, and all sorts of fun stuff. And the title of this episode you might recognize if you're a follower of the Backward Compatible podcast, our other project, or we'll occasionally talk about ROLL play for ROLE play. And Doc, do you want to go ahead and sort of explain a little bit more what we mean by this and how this all came to be?
Yes. Okay. So this is actually one of my favorite illustrations of the fundamental ridiculousness of the roleplay versus gameplay argument. And it actually came out of the 2010 April Fool's Day joke played by Wizards of the Coast via their website. Whenever a new, albeit fake, D&D tome, role-playing for role-playing, that's ROLL-playing for ROLE-playing, was announced. So it was overtly cynical. It was an ad. It proclaimed itself to be the unnecessary game core rules, which is, I think, fantastic, as an expansion for the 4th edition. And it proudly proclaimed, and I quote, "Swinging swords and slinging spells in combat with fantastic creatures isn't all you'll want to do in your D&D game." It actually said wanna, by the way. "There could be a time when you want your character to do something radical. Maybe you want to have a conversation with an NPC. Perhaps you want to exhibit a quirky trait or mannerism. There could even be an opportunity to wear an interesting hat or something. Clearly, you'll need extensive rules, charts, and tables for doing things that are pretty much just creatively describing your actions. That's when you turn to Role-Playing for Role-Playing, the most in-depth book of guidelines that will govern everything else in your character does. There's never been D&D rules like this before, mainly because you don't need them."
And I think that right there is kind of the point, is that like
it's so tongue-in-cheek.
These are all things that, like, you know, like we were talking about in our previous episode, story games, how there's a lot of stuff that happens beyond the core rules of the system, and the core rules will like point you in a different direction for how the game tends to be played and what you tend to like sort of see happen in the narratives that sort of emerge from them. But a lot of role play actually is just kind of ignoring the rules and role playing, being in character and talking and saying what you're doing.
Well, I wrote a whole chapter on this actually, and I used that quote in the chapter, and it's in Dungeons and Dragons and Philosophy. If you want to pick up a copy of that, I get no royalties for it, so you can rest easily there that
this isn't just a plug.
I get nothing, but I did that work for free. But basically, what I argue in that is exactly this: that the old dynamic of there being a game versus story is wrong. Mm-hmm. And I would say that this example, this humorous example, the reason that the humor works, the reason that it works farcically is because Wizards was saying, guys, this is a false dynamic. This is not how this works. We're giving you the rules for the crunch stuff, but you are responsible for telling your story. If you're a bad storyteller, that's on you. Now, in our last episode, we talked about games that actually really help you and encourage you in telling that story. But this is a different kind of discussion, because what we're talking about here is, when do you actively engage in one over the other? When do you actively choose to engage with those dice mechanics or rolling mechanics, or in the broader sense, the crunch, versus, you know what, we're just going to tell our story here. And I think that's a super important discussion, which is why we're having it.
And so I think that if you kind of ask the question, there's a kind of a couple of different philosophies here. Like if you look at the history of Dungeons and Dragons, I think we might have talked a little bit about this before. It came from a game called Chainmail, and Chainmail was a take on wargaming. It was basically medieval wargaming. Mm-hmm. And I think, actually, did Chainmail introduce the fantasy element? I think it might have.
Well,
or was D&D the first one to do that?
No, D&D really arguably was the first one to do that, I would say. But, there's a fuzzy line there because some would jump up and scream and say, no, that doesn't even count because it was more geared towards tabletop miniatures and simulationist, even more hard simulationist, as opposed to creating your own fantasy world, which is what D&D was really about.
Right. And so the reason I bring that up is to say that the philosophy behind this was, it was built around essentially a genre of gaming that was competitive. It's got the idea that you've got two armies that are going up against each other, and usually a war game would also have a referee, kind of an impartial third party.
Super good point.
The referee is kind of translated now into the GM role, and they're the ones who are making sure the rules are enforced, right. Or if there's ever a call to be made, like, well, in this case, it could go either way, they'll sort of say, here's what we're going to do.
Hey, I love having a designated GM on board game night. Whether you're just pulling out Age of Empires or Twilight Imperium, having somebody who's like, okay, I am the official rule judge here, and I will govern the game. And there's no story being told other than the so-and-so is attacking so-and-so. It's great to have a referee. So yeah, absolutely. But am I to imply then that what you're saying is that whenever you're sitting around the table doing a pencil paper tabletop role play game, that you should be working together and it's not a versus environment?
That's part of what I'm saying. The other thing I was going to sort of bring up, it's sort of relates to that. These systems were in place to kind of determine, when I say, here's my intention, I want to make this happen, what rules are around whether or not you succeed at doing that. So for example, I'm going to attack you. Obviously, in my world, I would love just for that attack to succeed and we move on. But
although narratively, sometimes it's more interesting if you fail.
Exactly. And so I think that what will end up happening is, instead of just saying in this war game, I'm going to attack this person, I'm going to win. Well, no, there's, people who are fighting back against you and they want just as much to defeat you. So we're going to resolve this with, say, a roll of the dice.
Right.
And this is kind of, in a different sense, kind of what we're getting to with the narrative, because to your point, sometimes narratively it is more interesting if you fail. And what the dice or the rules or the mechanics or whatever it happens to be in role-playing games do is they introduce uncertainty. It's not just going to go the way you want because it's boring, but it's also kind of boring if you know when things are going to fail, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
The other thing that this kind of does, and we can kind of explore both of these topics a little bit further as we keep going, because role-playing games are collaborative storytelling ventures, what these rules do is help to kind of provide a framework. They help to facilitate and kind of, in addition to the referee maybe making some calls on things, kind of establish for everyone the common rules of, here's how this sort of thing is decided. Yeah. Not just, well, I want my character to do this. Well, I don't think that's realistic. Or I don't want your character to do that. When anytime there's conflict between people, or even when, say, the GM, who's sort of responsible a lot of times for making sure that adversity is introduced to the narrative, they'll say, hey, it's within my power to throw a wrench into your works right now.
Yes.
And that's kind of, I think, the importance of mechanics, or at least the function of mechanics in a storytelling game, in a role-playing game.
I love what you're arguing here because, for decades and decades and decades, we've had these, I can call them miniature war games and things like that. So those were some of the earliest games. Even before role-play was a thing, we had those. And it started kind of as like Civil War reenactments and things like that. So
Napoleonic is really popular
Napoleonic,
too.
Yeah, World War II. So let's say you're doing a very famous battle reenactment, and you pull out the two sides, and you basically what you're saying is, if I had been the general here, my wish fulfillment fantasy is that I would have won this battle that was historically lost, or I would have won it a different way with less casualties, or whatever. That's the sort of the conceit that we're engaging in.
That flanking maneuver they did in history was so ill-advised. What they should have done is pushed up the front.
Right, exactly. Custer's last stand would have been his great victory if it had been me. You know what I'm saying? That kind of a thing. And I think that's important to note there, that what you're talking about is a player versus player construct with a referee, which you mentioned, and in role play, where we don't have the miniatures often, sometimes we do, what we're doing then is we're shifting the antagonistic force over into the GM's purview and letting it be the orcs or the necromancer or whatever it is.
The world at large.
The world at large even, or just, the dragon, the dungeon itself, right? And then putting the two players on the same side. And hopefully it's more than two players at that point. You've got 3 or 4 or 5 or maybe more. And all of them are then teaming up, and you've changed the granularity. So you're no longer commanding armies, though sometimes you can be. You're commanding an individual character. And so all of that is simply to say that whenever we think about what the mechanics are there for, which is that question that you were asking, we can say that they're there for it's there for a different reason now. And that reason is not a PvP kind of a scenario, though technically the GM is a player, not a player who's governing player characters.
Yeah. And it's in a sense kind of like it adds a little bit of, for lack of a better term, perhaps procedurality to it.
Oh, good. Yeah.
You're sort of, the story becomes in a sense sort of procedural in the sense that you're letting certain things be determined by the system or by chance, that sort of thing, at sort of key points that each system is kind of going to think about at what points do we want to introduce this uncertainty. So there are a lot of times when you might just say, to your point previously about Indiana Jones just pulling out his pistol and shooting the guy, that being it, the GM can say, great, let's roll with it. And just like, that's
roll with it. That's a great title for a system.
No pun intended. Yeah. You can just say that happens. But in certain systems, or depending on like the story that's being told or the way the GM wants the world to work, they might say, no, there's no kind of like free shots like that in this narrative or the way that we're doing this.
Right.
And so you're going to roll to see, does the shot hit or not?
Yeah.
That sort of thing. And so I think that in a lot of storytelling games, you might have just said, yeah, great, that happens. But some people might say, no, this guy in your way is actually important to the way that I want this to play out as the GM. I wanted this to be an actual obstacle. And so I'm going to say, no, you're going to have to roll to hit. And then if you miss, then we're going to go into possibly like a hand-to-hand fight, that sort of thing.
And by introducing that random element, then, we can have some control over it. Like, if like I want to attempt this skill that I'm really terrible and untrained at, well, guess what? You're probably going to fail if the system is done well.
Right.
Versus this is my expertise. This is the thing I've trained in. I'm a katana master. It would be really weird if I failed this, but I'm going to go ahead and do it on the off chance that it might happen. Per that notion of failure makes for interesting story. Where it becomes interesting, I think, is whenever you then have to do something in a different way. You're then challenged to overcome it in a way that's not natural for your character, or maybe the role play, RLE play, has to then overcome the limitations or the failures that were brought about by a bad role in ROLL play.
Right. And, talking a little bit about emergent stories and emergent or things that emerge from the gameplay. And it's something like, say, Dungeons and Dragons, where you've got HP and all this other stuff. You get into a fight and maybe you're, by all rights, you should have won it, but somehow you're just rolling poorly and stuff like that. Yes. It adds an element of danger and the unexpected, and there is no guarantee that you're going to survive this dungeon just because you think you should. But also it kind of, this sense of danger, because that game is largely about adventuring and kind of succeeding at these quests and defeating the monster and getting the loot and gaining the experience, et cetera, it can lead to some kind of like cool story moments that you might not have thought of if the system hadn't sort of introduced some of these hardships for you. I think like one of the greatest things about systems like this is that, you could tell the story after the fact of like, we were fighting this dragon and all of us were one hit away from dying. And I had like, this just sort of like Hail Mary pass I wanted to throw, so to speak. Today we're happen to be recording on Super Bowl Sunday, but I'm just kind of going for like this like crazy reckless attack. If I pull this off, we win. But if I don't, then I'm dead. And you roll the dice and it wins and it's like, oh, we did it. And it's like kind of like this amazing moment. And so like, there's some really great things that can come out of the system introducing elements that you might not have introduced yourself, because ultimately, like, even if we are trying to tell a story, a lot of us aren't authors, right? And even if we are authors, we have this process of writing and then revising and then revising and then having test readers tell us what's wrong with it and then revising in order to get something that's actually like good and compelling. It's hard to do that just off the cuff.
Right.
And if you get something like, decent, but it's not quite that good. And so what this procedurality does, what these rules can help you with, is getting you something interesting as a result of the systems rather than having to be just everything coming out of my own head.
Well, that's exactly right. It's funny. You saying all that actually reminds me of the Drew Hayes series, NPCs, which is a book, but it's also an audio book and very extremely well read by Roger Wayne. But basically, it's the story of these adventurers told from the NPC's perspective, and they have to imitate and pretend and pose as the what we would think of as the PCs, but just as adventurers. And there's some really fun meta moments with that because he really knows his audience. He knows what he's doing, and it flashes out into the real world, and there's all this other stuff. And I think that interplay between what's happening with the players and what's happening with the characters is super important within the context of are you just rolling dice or are you telling a story? And so, there's kind of an irony there too, I think. We're all looking for our Gandalf moment or our, by which I mean, Bridge, Balrog, all that. Or maybe, Frodo and the Troll moment, something like that. But I think we're also, depending on the type of story we're trying to tell the character, not just the character's story, but the player's story. So the irony comes into this idea of, as I retell my story to someone who wasn't in that game, they're going to gloss over, they're going to do the little stare, and they're going to go, you're playing what now? What? Is this a video game? No, it's a board game. What? And it's going to be very difficult to retell that story in a meaningful way for a couple of reasons. They weren't there, they weren't in it, and they didn't have the agency that you had. And I love this notion that in role play, you can do the most boring thing ever that would happen in a movie, but it's incredibly compelling and exciting that you went to town, which, if you look at it in terms of narrative tension, that's dropping through the floor.
Yeah.
But everybody has the greatest session ever, bargaining for their gear with the barkeep or the shopkeep because they were the ones doing it. And you can have some real fun with the characters and that kind of a thing, meet people and get the story hook. And you can spend 3 hours doing that. And it's even a slower pace than the extended edition Lord of the Rings. You know what I'm saying? But the agency is there. And I think that's an incredibly important key element to when do you use ROLL play, mechanics, and when do you, I would call fall back to the safe space of ROLE play. So that's the way I like to look at it. I like to look at it as something that has a nice coat of role play around the mechanics, and yet the bones are also the story too. So it's like the engine gets us there, like a game engine.
It's in all good stories, like I've kind of said already, there are going to be obstacles and there are going to be things that get in the player's way, and the rules are kind of that thing that helps you to have obstacles that don't just exist, but also have a chance of you failing. Because what we're doing is we're not just sort of like having, to your point about agency, we're not just hearing about something that happened to someone. And at that point you're thinking about like what is just the most entertaining thing, but also you're kind of living this out. And so if you go into it knowing exactly, here's how this is going to go, that's actually kind of boring. Like as a game, games require player skill. And sometimes that player skill is like, how good of a story can I tell? Sometimes the player skill is how well can I talk to this person, or maybe like act like I'm, sort of like fool this person into believing something. That's just like part of a conversation you might have in role play, assuming you're not just doing kind of like I'm going to roll to see if I can deceive them, which
roll
is
for persuasion,
which is a valid thing too, if that's
if
that's the way you want to play it.
Well, I love what you just said there, because let's say that you are going to roll to deceive or whatever. Well, first of all, you've got that moment of, okay, well, are you trying to lie to him, or are you using your charisma? Are you going to tell the truth, or are you trying to manipulate him? And that might change the stat you roll. Then after you roll the stat, it's like, okay, you succeeded, role play it. And I love that phrase when the GM says, okay, let's role play this out. We already know the outcome. You've succeeded in intimidating that shopkeeper. He's going to give you the discount, but I want to hear you say the words, and I want to respond to you in character as the shopkeeper and be able to use my dwarf voice to say, "Don't kill me. Whatever you do, just take the loot," and that to me is that coat that I was talking about. That's the layer of good, meaningful role play, because what are you going to really remember when the session is over? If you remember that moment at all, is it going to be that 18 that you rolled on the D20, or is it going to be that really fun moment you had where your character interacted with the other? And
on the flip side, like one of the benefits of having that role in the first place is when you say, okay, let's role play it. I might be, for example, playing a character that I can kind of direct better than I can actually portray, because my personality might be completely different from them. And, there's something to be said too, and we'll get to this in another episode of, playing someone who's maybe a little bit more like you that you can sort of actually play as, if that makes sense. But, like say that I'm going to try to intimidate them, but I am terrible at acting intimidating. And so it's like, okay, so it's a good thing I already know I succeeded, because if it was based on my ability to play this out as a person, I don't come across as very intimidating. And so, there's even something to be said for maybe even not role playing that moment, just to say, yeah, that's what happens.
Right. Well, you mentioned Cap Lucky Strike. I'll do that now and mention my example from this, where there was a moment where Sarge knew exactly what to do in terms of commanding his men and strategizing and war. And, Doc is like, I don't have a clue. And so I just said to our GM, Kevin, okay, so Sarge would know what to do here, but I have no clue. And then Kevin told me what Sarge would know, because he has a more military background.
Right. Yeah.
He served. So it's really neat then in that moment to have that out of character role play that where you're like, okay, well, I think maybe your character would say this, and then you can even actually say it. You just parrot it back, but you do it in character, and there's no need to do that. But if you do that, it brings us back in.
And it's kind of like, you look at a very sort of traditional way of GMing, for say Dungeons and Dragons, you say, okay, roll to attack this goblin. And then I roll and I say, cool, I succeeded. And then the GM describes for you what your character does to defeat the goblin.
Right.
And so sometimes it comes down to just what the players want to do. If they say, no, I want to be able to describe what I do here. And sometimes the GM will let them do it. It's not mutually exclusive. The GM can sometimes let the player describe it. Sometimes they'll take the reins and describe it, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And so it really just depends on how it is you're wanting to present the sort of narrative that's coming out of the mechanical stuff that you're doing.
Yeah. I think that the movie Gamers 2, Darkness Rising, which I think every role player should see, does a wonderful, wonderful job of depicting what you just said. And there's this moment where the bard rolls for bardic knowledge, and then the GM hands him a little note, and he reads the note, and he gets to the end of the note, and the phrase is like, which sucked. And then he flips it over and he's like, oh, all of the wind out of finishes the sentence.
Right.
And it's like that. You get this real sense sometimes of, I'm playing way out of my league here, but that comes back to the wish fulfillment idea again of, I'm really playing this character because I want to explore these alternatives. And again, we'll come back to that in another episode.
Or just because your party needed the bard and you drew the short straw.
No party needs a bard, Chris. Don't be ridiculous.
Yeah. Yeah, but that's a totally different discussion.
Oh, yeah.
Darkness Rising reminds me that sometimes the rules are a way for, again, the GM to rein players in a little bit. Your little anecdote about NPCs, the book, also made me think of this, where some of the players in this group are kind of jerks. And there's like, the one player who's not in that particular group at the beginning. And so in a sense, like, not to say that, and this is a situation that hopefully you can avoid if you and your group have a good chemistry and you're all you go into it knowing what to expect and what everyone wants from the experience. Where like the GM can kind of use the rules as justification to like push back gently on the players, or maybe not so gently, depending.
Right.
The GM says like, hey, we're going to be playing a very sort of simulationist game right now. I want everyone to come into this understanding that that's the sort of game we're playing. And then they just eat the mushrooms in the forest without checking to see what they are. And then they die because they weren't sort of engaging in that experience.
I told you this game would be more realistic.
And so, like the conflict between players and GM and stuff like that is a totally different discussion I'm not getting into right now.
Yeah.
But that being said, as long as like everyone's kind of on board with it, the GM can kind of use the rules to kind of like nudge and to remind everyone like, hey, here's the direction this ought to be going in. Or even to like, the players discovering, and this can be part of the fun sometimes, discovering that in this world and in this system, this thing that I normally would do doesn't work. And learning that is actually part of the fun of mastering that system and learning to play the game. The role of the GM is not to like control the way the story is going to go. That's actually part of the reason too that sometimes you have randomization, is that the GM also can't just dictate and say, this is how the story is going to go.
So true.
The players have a chance to justifiably say, no, like I should be able to roll for this. And the like kind of it's the rules are the conflict settler, as I mentioned earlier.
Yes.
So the rules can kind of help to facilitate this collaborative storytelling thing where everyone kind of wants something out of it, but we know that we're all working together to tell a story or to have this experience. And the rules being there is one way in which everyone can kind of come away from it satisfied.
Yep. Unless it's grapple.
Yeah.
If it's grapple rules, no one's satisfied.
Right. But it's not just, I wanted this to happen, but so-and-so won the argument and now I feel like crap because I lost an argument and this was supposed to be fun. And so like the rules are kind of like an excuse in a way to kind of use maybe a word that doesn't sound all that great, but it's an excuse to sort of say, no, when we came to a point of conflict, it was resolved by something arbitrary.
Yes.
And that can kind of help to make the experience more enjoyable for everyone.
Very, very true. I guess the point here is simply this, that the mechanics need to serve the story that you're telling. They need to serve the role play that you're intending to do. But, and this is a big but, likewise, the role play that you do should be within the context of the mechanics, and they really need to have an interplay. They need to be like interlocking gears that when one turns, the other turns with it.
Right.
And I think that a well-designed system is going to do that, and a system which is unto itself very, very crunchy will, I think, allow for the other kind, but not necessarily require it or determine it or predict it.
Yeah,
newer systems.
Yeah, it's a little bit more like a tool that, if used correctly, can be very powerful. If used poorly, can mess things up.
Yeah, that's true. And you can end up with a very shallow and disappointing game about a couple of guys going through a forest. I think the phrase "murder hobos" has been used to describe kind of that mentality.
Check out the Backward Compatible podcast for a little bit of context on that.
Jim brought that one to our attention. Anyway, good discussion.
Yeah, for sure. So thank you everyone for joining us for this discussion on roleplay for roleplay, ROLL versus ROLE, or maybe the verses should be taken out of that. You decide. So I'm Chris.
I'm Doc.
And we'll see you next time. The Doc and Krueger cast is a production of Doc and Krueger Games, jointly hosted by Adam Doc Brackin and Chris Krueger. The theme music was composed by Nick Krueger. The Roll With It system is available now. You can find it and our other games through our website, docandkrueger.com.